The neurologist has already signed the medical certification, Mother. Late stage, rapid onset dementia, entirely irreversible. Phone to me at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. You cannot sign a check. You cannot authorize the sale of this estate. You cannot even choose your own breakfast. Everything is now under my full conservatorship.
Richard's voice echoed through the cavernous, vaulted ceilings of the grand living room. It was a voice utterly devoid of warmth, stripped of any familial affection, and dripping with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate liquidator. He stood in the center of the room, clutching a thick, heavy stack of legal documents stamped with the red seal of the state Supreme Court. At 45 years old, Richard was draped in a bespoke, $4,000 Tom Ford suit, the sleeve perfectly tailored to display a platinum Patek Philippe watch, luxuries paid for entirely by the relentless labor and immense wealth of the elderly woman sitting quietly before him. A few feet away stood Sarah, his 38-year-old sister. She stood with her arms tightly crossed, nervously and impatiently tapping her manicured, diamond-adorned fingers against the quilted leather of her limited-edition Chanel handbag. Her eyes darted around the opulent room, mentally cataloging and appraising the antique Persian rugs, the original oil paintings, and the crystal chandeliers, as if she were a vulture circling a dying animal. She couldn't even bring herself to look her mother directly in the eye. The air in the $8 million mansion was suffocatingly thick, punctuated only by the slow, heavy, and indifferent ticking of a towering mahogany grandfather clock in the corner. Eleanor, 76 years old, sat in absolute silence on a plush, crimson velvet armchair. Her posture was rigidly straight, her silver hair elegantly pinned back, projecting the undeniable regal dignity of a woman who had, alongside her late husband, built a sprawling real estate empire from absolutely nothing. She was not crazy. She was not senile. She did not have dementia. Her mind at that very moment was sharper than a surgical scalpel. She could recall the exact compounding interest rates of her diverse investment portfolios. She could remember the precise scent of the rain on the day she and her husband bought their first modest apartment building 50 years ago. She knew the names, birthdays, and middle names of every single one of her grandchildren. But in the ruthlessly exploitative legal system of the United States, an elderly person's pristine sanity means absolutely nothing when their greedy, biological children are willing to use immense wealth to fabricate a lie. Richard had quietly paid off a morally bankrupt, high-society neurologist, a doctor more than willing to accept a massive, under-the-table consulting fee, in exchange for drafting a fraudulent medical evaluation, declaring Eleanor completely mentally incompetent. Armed with that forged paper, Richard and Sarah had filed an emergency ex parte guardianship petition. They deliberately bypassed standard legal protocols, successfully arguing to a fatigued judge that Eleanor was an immediate danger to herself and her estate. Conservatorship, a legal mechanism originally designed to protect the highly vulnerable, had been weaponized. With a single stroke of a judge's pen, Eleanor had been legally erased from existence. She was now a prisoner in her own home, stripped of every fundamental constitutional right, merely waiting to be discarded. "What exactly are you two doing?" Eleanor finally spoke. Her voice did not shake. There were no tears, no hysterical screaming, and no desperate begging. Her tone was chillingly calm, slicing straight through the thick, arrogant facade of her two children. "We are doing what is best for you, Mom," Sarah chimed in, her voice pitching up into a shrill, incredibly patronizing tone, the kind one might use to soothe a confused toddler. "You've been so forgetful lately. Remember last week? You left your reading glasses in the kitchen. You simply cannot live alone in an 8,000-square-foot house anymore. The property taxes and maintenance are a massive drain on liquid capital, and we desperately need the equity. Richard's tech startup is on the verge of total bankruptcy, and my personal trust fund is facing a severe deficit due to, well, the rising costs of inflation. What is the point of you hoarding this massive estate when you are just going to die soon anyway?" Sarah's words dropped into the room like concentrated drops of battery acid, burning away the very last shreds of Aliner's maternal mercy. Aliner looked at the two human beings she had carried in her womb. These were the children she had stayed up with through endless nights of fever. These were the children whose exorbitant Ivy League tuition she had paid in cash. She had loved them unconditionally, bylaid them out of their reckless financial mistakes, and shielded them from every hardship. And in return, she had successfully raised two soulless parasites, eagerly waiting to carve up her corpse before her heart had even stopped beating. Richard took a step forward and casually tossed a cheap, glossy brochure onto the heavy, tempered glass coffee table. The thin paper slid across the smooth surface, stopping precisely at the edge, right in front of Aliner. Bold, generic letters across the top of the brochure read, "Shady Pines Care Facility, a place for golden years." Below the text was a poorly lit, highly saturated photograph of a depressing, gray brick building surrounded by a dying lawn. The extreme, sickening contrast of the situation hung heavily in the air. Richard and Sarah were preparing to liquidate a magnificent $8 million architectural masterpiece to fund their luxury yachts, European vacations, and country club memberships. Yet, for the mother who gave them everything, they had deliberately selected the absolute cheapest, state-subsidized, bottom-tier nursing home in the county. It was a facility notorious for chronic understaffing, a place that perpetually smelled of industrial bleach, pureed food, and the dense, inescapable despair of abandoned elders waiting for the end. They refused to spend even a fraction of her own wealth on premium care. They wanted every last dollar for themselves. "The specialized medical transport is already idling in the driveway," Richard stated, checking his platinum watch with cold indifference. "They are going to escort you to Shady Pines. Do not bother packing a bag, mother. The facility provides standardized patient gowns for all residents, and I highly advise you not to resist. It is completely legal. If you scream or cause a scene, the orderlies have strict legal authorization to inject you with heavy sedatives, in accordance with standard protocols for combative dementia patients." As if on cue, the heavy oak double doors of the living room swung open. Two massive, broad-shouldered medical orderlies wearing faded blue scrubs stepped into the room. They pushed a squeaky, rusted metal wheelchair over the $1 million Persian rug. They did not greet Aliner. They did not look at her as a human being. They approached her with the detached, mechanical apathy of movers preparing to haul away a broken piece of furniture. Aliner did not fight them. She understood the ruthless mechanics of power better than anyone in the room. If she screamed, if she cried, if she desperately pleaded her sanity, it would only give them the visual proof of hysteria they needed to justify the heavy chemical sedatives. She maintained her absolute, unbreakable composure. She slowly stood up from the velvet armchair, meticulously smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her expensive silk blouse. She held her head high, radiating an aura of total, unyielding supreme dignity, and voluntarily sat down in the squeaking metal wheelchair. As the larger orderly reached over to aggressively buckle the heavy nylon safety strap across her chest, Aliner lifted her chin. She fixed her icy, piercing eyes first on Sarah, who nervously looked away, and then on Richard, who tried to maintain his arrogant smirk. The decades of unconditional, forgiving maternal love in Aliner's eyes had completely died. In its place was an abyss of absolute, terrifying silence. "Do you honestly believe that a forged piece of paper gives you the keys to my kingdom?" Aliner whispered. Her voice was incredibly low, but it carried a crushing, gravitational weight that caused Richard's arrogant smirk to falter slightly. "Greed is a disease that makes you blind, Richard, but your sheer arrogance, that is what will dig your grave. Enjoy my home. Enjoy it while you still can." Richard swallowed hard, his throat suddenly tight. He aggressively waved his hand, silently ordering the men to get her out of his sight. The wheels of the rusty chair clattered loudly against the pristine marble floors as Aliner was wheeled out of the grand double doors, leaving the opulent mansion behind to step into the dark, suffocating back of the transport van. Richard and Sarah let out a collective sigh of relief, completely convinced they had just executed the perfect crime. They had absolutely no idea that their elderly mother's final look was not the desperate gaze of a defeated victim. It was the cold, calculating glare of an apex predator who had just quietly set a lethal, inescapable trap, preparing to unleash absolute financial apocalypse upon the children who had betrayed her. Welcome back to our channel, friends. Before we continue with tonight's story, please take a quick moment to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video so you never miss an episode. Let us know in the comments, have you ever witnessed the tragic reality of how the elderly are treated in modern society? We read every single comment. 2 months. 61 agonizing days had passed since the heavy, rusted iron gates of Shady Pines Care Facility slammed shut behind Alina Ashford. It was not a place of healing. It was a dark, forgotten warehouse for the discarded. The air inside the sprawling, state-subsidized building was a suffocating, heavy cocktail of industrial bleach, boiled cabbage, and the unmistakable, lingering scent of human despair. The fluorescent lights overhead constantly flickered and buzzed like dying insects, casting a sickly, pale yellow glow over the peeling linoleum floors. Alina's new reality was a claustrophobic, 10 by 10 foot cinderblock cell shared with a heavily medicated woman who stared blankly at the ceiling all day. There were no million-dollar Persian rugs here. There were no mahogany grandfather clocks or sweeping views of manicured gardens. There was only the agonizingly slow, rhythmic drip of a leaky bathroom faucet, and the distant, muffled cries of people who had been entirely forgotten by the outside world. Every evening at 6:00 p.m., a notoriously cruel head nurse named Brenda would march into Alina's room. Brenda was a woman who deeply despised her underpaid job and took her bitter frustrations out on the defenseless residents. She wore tight, faded scrubs, aggressively chewed peppermint gum with an open mouth, and spoke to the elderly patients in a deafening, incredibly patronizing baby voice. "Time for our dinner, Ellie Belly," Brenda shouted on a rainy Tuesday evening, violently slamming a cracked, beige plastic tray onto Alina's rolling metal table. Alina looked down at the tray in absolute disgust. It was a grotesque, unidentifiable pile of pureed, grayish meat and heavily watered-down mashed potatoes, served alongside a plastic sippy cup of lukewarm tap water. Because Richard's fraudulent medical file explicitly labeled Alina as a severe dementia risk with a high choking hazard, she was legally forbidden from being given solid food or actual metal silverware. She was treated like an incompetent infant. "I would prefer a cup of hot black tea, Brenda," Alina said, her voice perfectly steady, highly articulate, and completely lucid. "And please do not address me as Ellie Belly. My name is Mrs. Ashford." Brenda dramatically rolled her eyes, completely ignoring the perfectly constructed, highly intelligent sentence. In Brenda's arrogant mind, anyone with a dementia tag on their wrist was already a ghost, devoid of any human rights. "Oh, is the Queen feeling a little fussy today? Eat your applesauce, sweetie, before I have to log you as combative in the system and call the heavy orderlies to strap you down to the bed." Brenda scoffed, turning on her squeaking rubber-soled shoes and marching out of the room, deliberately leaving the heavy wooden door wide open to strip Alina of her privacy. Alina did not touch the gray sludge. She simply pushed the rolling table away, folded her delicate, aging hands in her lap, and looked out the narrow, iron-barred window at the dying oak tree in the courtyard. She was starving. The hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she absolutely refused to surrender her dignity to a plastic tray. Then, the rhythmic, squeaking sound of a mop bucket echoed from the dim hallway. A young man stepped quietly into the room. His name was Matteo. He was 28 years old, a first-generation immigrant working 3 grueling, back-breaking minimum-wage jobs just to keep his own mother's heating on in a tiny, drafty apartment across the city. Matteo wore a stained, oversized gray janitor's uniform. His hands were heavily calloused, his knuckles cracked and bleeding from harsh cleaning chemicals, and dark circles of permanent exhaustion hung heavy under his dark brown eyes. But unlike Richard, who wore a $4,000 Tom Ford suit and possessed a completely empty, sociopathic soul, Mateo wore cheap rags and carried a heart of pure gold. Mateo paused his mopping. He looked at the untouched tray of pureed food, and then he looked deeply at Alina. Mateo was the invisible man of Shady Pines. Nobody paid attention to the janitor. The doctors ignored him, and the nurses treated him like a piece of furniture. But precisely because he was invisible, Mateo saw absolutely everything. He had spent the last 2 months quietly observing Alina. He saw the way she meticulously folded her thin, scratchy hospital blanket every morning with military precision. He saw the sharp, incredibly calculating intelligence in her eyes when she watched the nurse's shift changes. Mateo knew, without a single shadow of a doubt, that the elderly woman sitting by the window was entirely, brilliantly sane. Mateo quietly stepped backward, closed the heavy wooden door to the room, and locked it from the inside, ensuring Nurse Brenda could not barge back in. He pushed his yellow mop bucket aside, reached deep into the bottom pocket of his oversized gray uniform, and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a clean, white cloth. He walked over to Alina and gently, reverently placed it on her rolling table. Alina looked down. It was a real, heavy ceramic teacup, not a plastic sippy cup. A beautifully painted porcelain cup that Mateo had bought for $2 at a local thrift store, and right next to it was a small, dented stainless steel thermos. Mateo unscrewed the cap of the thermos and carefully poured the steaming liquid into the porcelain cup. The rich, fragrant, intoxicating aroma of authentic, high-quality Earl Grey tea, steeped perfectly with a sharp hint of bergamot, instantly cut through the oppressive, sickening smell of the nursing home. "I noticed you haven't touched the food for 2 days, Mrs. Ashford," Mateo whispered, his voice deep, incredibly respectful and completely devoid of any insulting pity. "I remembered you mentioning to the doctor last month that you missed the taste of real Earl Grey. It isn't much, and I'm sorry I couldn't find any honey, but it's hot." Alina stared at the steaming teacup and then slowly looked up at the young janitor. A massive lump formed in her throat. It was a profound, aching wave of emotion that she had violently suppressed for 2 months. Her own flesh and blood, the biological children she had given millions of dollars to, had thrown her into a concrete cell to rot so they could buy luxury cars. Yet here was a total stranger, a young immigrant man who likely had less than $20 in his checking account, spending his hard-earned money and risking his only source of income just to bring an old woman a momentary taste of human dignity. "Thank you, Mateo," Alina said softly, picking up the warm porcelain cup. Her hands did not shake in the slightest. She took a slow sip. The warmth spread through her chest. It was the most magnificent thing she had tasted in 61 days. "You shouldn't risk your employment for me. If Brenda catches you giving me unauthorized items, she will have you fired instantly." "Some things in this world are more important than keeping a job, ma'am," Mateo smiled gently, leaning his tired weight onto the wooden handle of his mop. "My mother always taught me that how you treat the elderly is a direct reflection of your own soul. You aren't crazy, Mrs. Ashford. I know you aren't. And I know you do not belong in a place like this." Alina slowly set the porcelain teacup down on the table. The icy, calculating apex predator that had been lying completely dormant inside her for 2 months suddenly awakened. She looked at Mateo's calloused, honest, battered hands. Alina had spent a 50-year career aggressively evaluating the true character of powerful businessmen, ruthless politicians, and elite corporate investors. She knew a magnificent investment when she saw one. And looking at the humble, exhausted janitor standing before her, Alina made the single most consequential, devastating decision of her entire life. "Mateo," Alina whispered, her voice suddenly dropping an octave, radiating the intense, undeniable authority of a corporate titan preparing for war. "I need you to do something for me, something highly dangerous. It could very well cost you your job, but if it works, I give you my absolute word, your life will never be the same." Mateo stopped smiling. He stood up perfectly straight, immediately sensing the absolute, terrifying gravity in her tone. "What do you need me to do, Mrs. Ashford?" Alina leaned forward, her sharp, piercing eyes locking onto his. "I need your cell phone, and I need 10 minutes of absolute, uninterrupted privacy. There is a private estate lawyer I need to contact immediately, and my greedy son, Richard, has absolutely no idea he even exists." The crisp, deafening pop of a $500 bottle of Dom Perignon vintage champagne echoed through the cavernous living room of the Ashford estate. It was a sound of absolute, unadulterated desecration. 15 miles away from the bleak, bleach-soaked walls of shady pines, Richard and Sarah were busy ripping the very soul out of the magnificent $8 million mansion their mother had spent half a century building. The grand, opulent living room, once filled with the warmth of family holidays and the quiet dignity of a life well lived, had been transformed into a cold, ruthless staging area for a high-society liquidation. A team of professional estate liquidators and cleaners swarmed the house like locusts, ruthlessly stripping the walls of antique oil paintings and meticulously wrapping Persian rugs in heavy industrial plastic. Standing in the center of the chaos, entirely unfazed by the systematic erasure of his mother's legacy, was Richard. He wore a tailored charcoal blazer, casually holding a crystal flute of bubbling champagne. Beside him stood Sarah, aggressively tapping her designer heels against the imported marble floor, and a slick, aggressively tanned high-end real estate broker named Julian Vance. "To the future, Julian," Richard smirked, raising his crystal glass to clink against the broker's. "And to the highest bidder. I want this absolute dinosaur of a house wiped clean, staged with modern, minimalist Italian furniture, and listed on the international luxury market by Friday." Julian Vance chuckled, taking a slow sip of the expensive champagne, his greedy eyes already calculating his 6% commission on an $8 million cash sale. "It's a spectacular property, Richard. A bit dated, terribly old-fashioned, but the bones are magnificent. We are going to spark a massive bidding war among the overseas tech billionaires. You hold the absolute power of attorney and the full conservatorship over the estate, correct? The title company will need an ironclad guarantee that the old woman can't suddenly contest the sale." "My mother's brain is entirely reduced to mush, Julian. She doesn't even know her own name, let alone how to spell the word lawyer," Richard laughed, the sound dripping with sociopathic cruelty. "The state Supreme Court handed me the keys to the kingdom 2 months ago. The conservatorship is bulletproof. The property, the liquid accounts, the offshore bonds, they are all legally mine to manage. Consider this my early inheritance." Sarah scoffed loudly, waving a manicured hand dismissively toward a pair of movers who were carefully boxing up a collection of fine bone china. "Just throw it all in the dumpster. God, why are you being so gentle with that junk? It smells like mothballs and old people in here." She turned back to Julian, her eyes flashing with a sickening, shallow greed. "Richard needs the capital to bail out his pathetic, bankrupt tech startup, but I have my eyes set on a spectacular summer villa in Lake Como, Italy. So please, Julian, price this house aggressively. I am not waiting 6 months to get my payout. I want my money now." To punctuate her sheer entitlement, Sarah reached into a nearby cardboard box that the movers had labeled personal keepsakes. She pulled out a heavy, beautifully bound leather photo album. It was Alina's wedding album from 1968. Inside were the irreplaceable, fading photographs of Alina and her late husband, the only physical proof of the beautiful, enduring love story that had created Richard and Sarah in the first place. Sarah didn't even open it. With a look of absolute, breathtaking apathy, she tossed the heavy leather album directly into a black, heavy-duty trash bag filled with crumpled packing paper and broken picture frames. "Out with the old, in with the new," Richard cheered, finishing his champagne in one gulp. He felt completely invincible. He believed he was a brilliant, untouchable mastermind who had successfully outsmarted the legal system, his own family, and the universe itself. He had absolutely no idea that 15 miles away, his supposedly brain-dead mother was already holding the match that was about to burn his entire stolen empire to the ground. Back in the dim, oppressive confines of Shady Pines Care Facility, the atmosphere was entirely different. Mateo, the exhausted young janitor, stood rigidly by the closed wooden door of Eleanor's cinderblock room. His heart was violently pounding against his ribs. He gripped the handle of his mop tightly, pretending to aggressively scrub a non-existent stain on the hallway linoleum. His eyes darted nervously down the corridor, watching for the terrifying, heavy-footed approach of Nurse Brenda. Giving a patient an unauthorized cell phone was a massive, instantly fireable offense, and Mateo's entire family depended on his meager paycheck to survive. Inside the room, sitting perfectly straight in her rusty metal wheelchair, Eleanor Ashford held Mateo's cheap, cracked, prepaid smartphone to her ear. The moment her fingers gripped the device, a profound, chilling transformation occurred. The frail, silent, elderly woman in the faded hospital gown vanished entirely. In her place sat the ruthless, razor-sharp matriarch of a real estate empire. Her posture hardened, her eyes narrowed with absolute, terrifying calculation, and she dialed a private, unlisted phone number from pure memory. The phone rang twice before it was answered by a deep, highly professional and incredibly sharp voice. Elias and Starling Legal Group, Elias speaking. Elias, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a lethal, authoritative register. It is Eleanor Ashford. There was a stunned, breathless pause on the other end of the line. A heavy chair squeaked as the high-powered attorney physically sat up straight in his mahogany office. Mrs. Ashford, Elias breathed out, his voice a mixture of immense relief and profound respect. My God, I have been desperately trying to locate you for 2 months. Your son legally blocked my firm from accessing your medical records, and he instituted a complete communication blackout. I was about to file an emergency habeas corpus petition with the federal court. Are you safe? Where are you? I am currently locked inside a state-funded warehouse for the dying called Shady Pines, Elias. Richard and Sarah bribed a neurologist to declare me completely incompetent. They seized the estate under an emergency conservatorship, Eleanor stated, her voice as cold and hard as a diamond. Those absolute fools, Elias growled, the anger of a fiercely loyal lawyer radiating through the phone speaker. Give me the word, Eleanor. I will have a team of federal litigators and independent medical examiners at that facility within the hour. We will shatter Richard's fraudulent conservatorship by tomorrow morning, and I will personally see to it that your son faces a 20-year prison sentence for elder abuse and medical fraud. No, Eleanor commanded, her single word slicing through the air like a guillotine blade. No, Elias asked, clearly confused. Eleanor, they are trying to steal your entire life. If we simply reverse the conservatorship, Elias, they will fight me in court for years, draining my accounts with legal fees, portraying me as a vindictive, confused old woman. I do not want to simply defeat them. I want to annihilate them. I want them to experience the exact, horrifying realization of absolute powerlessness that they forced upon me. Eleanor looked out the barred window, her eyes reflecting an icy, unstoppable vengeance. Did you execute the structural legal changes we discussed 2 years ago, Elias? The contingency plan I ordered when I first noticed Richard secretly auditing my bank accounts. Yes, ma'am, Elias confirmed, his tone shifting into absolute predatory corporate precision. 2 years ago, under your direct orders, every single liquid asset, the offshore accounts, and the entire physical deed to the $8 million mansion were quietly transferred out of your personal name. They are currently locked inside an irrevocable blind trust. It is a fortress, Eleanor. Because the trust was established long before any declaration of medical incompetence, it is entirely immune to Richard's conservatorship. Richard thinks he controls the estate, but legally, he has conservatorship over a ghost. He owns absolutely nothing. "That's perfect," Alina whispered, a chilling, triumphant smile finally gracing her lips. "Who is currently listed as the primary beneficiary and sole legal executor of that irrevocable trust?" "It is currently blank, awaiting your final authorization," Elias replied. Alina lowered the phone slightly, turning her gaze toward the small glass window on the heavy wooden door. She looked at Mateo. She watched the young, exhausted janitor nervously guarding the door, risking his livelihood, his family's survival, and his freedom, just to bring an abandoned old woman a cup of tea. He had shown her the only shred of human dignity she had experienced in 60 days. "I am officially authorizing the name of the new beneficiary and sole legal executor, Elias." "Write it down immediately," Alina ordered, her voice completely unwavering. "Ready, Mrs. Ashford." "His name is Mateo Vargas." Elias didn't question the order. He was a professional. "Understood. The documents will be legally binding the moment I hit enter. What is our next move, Alina?" Alina's eyes gleamed with a terrifying, absolute promise of destruction. "Richard is hosting a high society open house to sell my mansion this Saturday at noon. He is going to try to finalize the sale. Elias, I want you to print the finalized trust documents, stamp them with the federal seal, and drive to my house this Saturday. And I want you to bring Mateo with you." Alina took a slow, deep breath, preparing to unleash hell on the children who threw her away. It is time to drop the guillotine. Saturday afternoon at the Ashford estate was a masterclass in the grotesque theater of high society greed. The weather was absolutely immaculate, with a crisp, cloudless blue sky serving as the perfect backdrop for the multi-million-dollar architectural masterpiece. The sweeping, circular cobblestone driveway was completely choked with a glittering fleet of Aston Martins, Ferraris, and matte black Mercedes G-Wagons. Valets in crisp white shirts frantically sprinted back and forth, tossing luxury key fobs to one another as the ultra-wealthy elite of the city descended upon the property like a flock of impeccably dressed vultures. Inside the sprawling, 8,000-square-foot mansion, Julian Vance, the aggressively tanned real estate broker, had orchestrated an event that felt more like a royal coronation than an open house. Private caterers wearing white gloves weaved silently through the massive crowds, carrying silver platters stacked with beluga caviar on toasted brioche and delicate truffle crostinis. The grand living room, stripped of Alina's treasured memories and restaged with cold, soulless, minimalist Italian furniture, echoed with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the hollow, fake laughter of corporate titans negotiating deals. Richard and Sarah were absolutely in their element. They were floating through the grand foyer, absorbing the envy and admiration of the billionaire buyers as if they were royalty. The architecture is heavily inspired by late 19th century French chateaux, Richard boasted loudly to a Chinese tech mogul, swirling the expensive scotch in his crystal tumbler. He leaned casually against a massive marble pillar, looking exactly like the billionaire he desperately wanted to be. "My parents had excellent taste, of course. It's a tragedy, really." My mother's mind just evaporated. The dementia took her completely. She's essentially a ghost now. But as her sole legal guardian and conservator, it falls on my shoulders to liquidate the estate and guide our family into the future. Sarah, standing nearby in a stunning, backless emerald green designer dress, wiped a completely fake tear from the corner of her eye, careful not to ruin her $600 makeup. "It has been so traumatic for us," she sighed to a wealthy investor's wife. "But Richard and I are being strong. We just want to close this chapter quickly. Julian already has 3 all-cash offers on the table, well over asking price." They were already spending the money in their heads. Richard could practically feel the steering wheel of the new yacht he planned to buy, and Sarah was mentally decorating her summer villa in Lake Como. They felt utterly invincible, entirely protected by the thick, impenetrable armor of the American legal system. But at exactly 1 15 p.m., the perfectly orchestrated illusion of their absolute power hit a massive, immovable brick wall. The heavy, mahogany double doors of the mansion were propped wide open to let in the afternoon breeze. The rhythmic flow of luxury sports cars pulling up to the valet was suddenly interrupted by a massive, imposing, pitch-black Lincoln Navigator. The vehicle did not stop at the valet podium. It aggressively bypassed the attendants, the heavy tires crunching loudly over the cobblestones, and parked directly in front of the grand entrance, aggressively blocking a Lamborghini from pulling out. A valet rushed forward, waving his hands. "Excuse me, sir. You can't park here. This is the VIP loading zone." The heavy driver's side door swung open, and the valet instantly went dead silent, stepping back in sheer intimidation. Stepping out of the driver's seat was Elias Sterling. Elias was a man who did not need a sports car to announce his presence. He was 60 years old, with slick-back silver hair and the cold, predatory eyes of a great white shark. He wore a devastatingly sharp, charcoal-gray pinstripe suit that projected an aura of absolute, terrifying corporate authority. In his left hand, he gripped a heavy, scuffed leather briefcase locked with two brass combination dials, a briefcase that currently held the weapon of mass financial destruction Alina had armed. Elias did not even glance at the valet. He simply walked around the front of the massive SUV and opened the passenger door. The man who stepped out of the passenger side caused the few guests lingering on the front portico to turn and stare in absolute silence. It was Matteo, but this was not the exhausted, hunched-over young immigrant who smelled of industrial bleach and mopped the peeling linoleum floors of Shady Pines. Over the past 48 hours, Elias had executed Alina's strict, uncompromising orders with ruthless efficiency. Matteo had been completely, astonishingly transformed. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored, midnight blue Italian wool suit that draped perfectly over his broad, working-class shoulders. His dark hair was immaculately styled. His shoes were polished, handmade black leather Oxfords that caught the sunlight with every step. He looked like a young, fiercely intelligent tech billionaire stepping out of a boardroom. The only remaining physical evidence of his grueling, impoverished past were his hands. As he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt, the heavy calluses and the faint, healing chemical burns on his knuckles were still visible, a stark, proud testament to a man who had built his soul through honest, agonizing labor. Matteo looked up at the towering, $8 million mansion. His heart pounded violently against his ribs, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. He remembered the cold, cinder-block cell Alina was locked inside. He remembered the pureed gray food. He squared his shoulders, channeling the icy, supreme dignity of the woman who had just trusted him with her entire empire. Elias placed a firm, reassuring hand on Matteo's shoulder. "Remember what we discussed, Mr. Vargas. Do not break eye contact. Do not flinch. Today, you are the king." Matteo nodded once. Together, the high-powered attorney and the former janitor walked up the grand stone steps and stepped through the mahogany doors into the crowded foyer. The sheer, overwhelming presence of Elias Sterling caused the crowd to naturally part. Conversations died out. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a vibrant celebration to a tense, suffocating silence. Richard, who was in the middle of laughing at a joke with the Chinese tech mogul, paused. He turned around, highly annoyed that the center of attention had shifted away from him. When Richard's arrogant eyes landed on Elias, his smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. He knew exactly who Elias was. Elias was his mother's fiercely loyal, terrifyingly brilliant private attorney, the one man Richard had desperately tried to block from accessing Alina's medical records. Elias. Richard hissed, aggressively pushing past the wealthy buyers and marching toward the entryway, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. "What the hell are you doing here? You are completely unauthorized to be on this property. You are not on the guest list, and your legal services were formally terminated by me 2 months ago." Elias simply stood there, completely unbothered, his hands resting comfortably on the handle of his leather briefcase. He looked at Richard as if he were observing a pathetic, noisy insect. Richard then shifted his aggressive glare to the young man standing right beside Elias in the midnight blue suit. For 3 excruciating seconds, Richard's brain simply could not process the visual information. The bespoke suit, the polished shoes, the confident posture, it all screamed extreme wealth. But the facial features were burned into Richard's memory. Richard possessed the unique, photographic memory of a supreme narcissist who never forgot the face of someone he considered beneath him. He remembered the day he dumped his mother at Shady Pines. He remembered the filthy young immigrant in the stained scrubs pushing a yellow mop bucket out of the way of the wheelchair. Richard's eyes widened in absolute, staggering disbelief, which rapidly mutated into venomous, uncontrollable outrage. "Wait a minute. I know you," Richard spat, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at Mateo's chest. The volume of his voice rose, echoing off the marble walls, drawing the attention of every single billionaire in the room. You're the filthy janitor. You're the guy mopping up urine at that state-funded dump I put my mother in." Sarah, hearing the commotion, rushed over. She looked at Mateo, her face twisting in utter revulsion, as if a sewer rat had just crawled onto her imported Persian rug. "A janitor? Richard, what is happening? Why is there a janitor in my house wearing a knockoff suit?" Richard let out a sharp, malicious, barking laugh, turning back to Elias. "Is this a joke, Elias? Did you really hire a minimum-wage charity case to carry your briefcase? Are you trying to stage some kind of pathetic, dramatic protest on behalf of my brain-dead mother?" Mateo did not flinch. He did not look at his shoes. He stared directly into Richard's arrogant eyes, his posture as immovable as a mountain. "Julian," Richard barked, snapping his fingers aggressively at the real estate broker who was nervously hovering nearby. "Call private security immediately. Have these 2 trespassing clowns physically thrown off my property." Richard puffed up his chest, taking a highly aggressive step toward Elias, entirely consumed by the delusion of his own absolute supremacy. "Listen to me very carefully, Elias," Richard snarled, his voice vibrating with venomous narcissistic rage. "I hold the conservatorship. I hold the absolute power of attorney. The Supreme Court of this state gave me the keys to this kingdom. I own this house, I own those offshore accounts, and I own you. Now get this pathetic, floor-scrubbing peasant out of my sight before I have you both arrested for criminal trespassing." Elias did not step back. He did not raise his voice. A slow, chilling, utterly terrifying smile crept across the ruthless lawyer's face. He lifted his heavy leather briefcase and laid it flat on the nearby marble entryway table. With 2 sharp, metallic clicks, the brass combination dials unlocked. "Richard," Elias whispered, his voice dripping with the promise of absolute, inescapable destruction. "You are about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between holding a piece of paper and actually owning a kingdom." The heavy, brass combination dials of Elias Sterling's scuffed leather briefcase clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot through the dead-silent grand foyer. Every single billionaire, corporate investor, and high society socialite in the room held their breath. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes had ceased entirely. The string quartet playing softly in the corner abruptly stopped mid-note. The only sound left in the sprawling 8,000-square-foot mansion was the soft rustle of heavy, cream-colored parchment paper as Elias slowly reached into the briefcase. He withdrew a thick, formidable stack of legal documents. They were not standard court printouts. These pages were bound in heavy blue legal backing, stamped with the raised, embossed seal of the Federal Treasury, and secured with the dark crimson wax seal of the State Registry. It was the physical manifestation of absolute, undeniable legal supremacy. Elias did not hand the documents to Richard. He simply laid them flat on the marble table, smoothing them out with his palm, keeping his predatory eyes locked on the arrogant son. "You are absolutely correct about one thing, Richard," Elias began, his voice dangerously quiet, yet carrying effortlessly across the vast room. You do hold a conservatorship. A judge did, in fact, grant you full legal authority over Alina Ashford's personal autonomy 2 months ago. You have the power to choose her medical treatments. You have the power to dictate where she sleeps. You possess the power of attorney over her personal name. Richard smirked, his chest puffing out again, regaining a fraction of his shattered confidence. He threw a triumphant, mocking glance toward the crowd of wealthy buyers. Exactly. I am the sole legal guardian. I am the law in this house. So pack up your little briefcase, Elias, and take your charity case janitor with you before I have you both in handcuffs. Unfortunately for you, Elias continued, completely ignoring Richard's pathetic outburst, his voice dropping to the surgical, chilling register of a master litigator delivering a death sentence. Alina Ashford does not own this house. Richard's smug smile froze, his brow furrowed in deep, aggressive confusion. What the hell are you talking about? Her name is on the deed. My father built this house for her. Elias slowly shook his head, looking at Richard with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. 2 years ago, Richard, your mother noticed a series of highly suspicious, unauthorized inquiries into her private banking accounts. She noticed that you were quietly communicating with offshore liquidators. Because she is a brilliant, visionary woman who built an empire while you were still spending your trust fund on sports cars, she anticipated your exact move. Elias tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the thick stack of documents. 24 months before you bribed a desperate, morally bankrupt neurologist to sign a fraudulent dementia evaluation. 24 months before you ambushed her with a corrupt emergency court order. Alina Ashford legally dissolved her entire personal estate. Every single liquid asset, the offshore corporate bonds, the luxury vehicle titles, and the master physical deed to this very mansion were legally transferred out of her name. A low, collective gasp rippled through the crowd of ultra-wealthy buyers. These were men and women who intimately understood the complex, ruthless architecture of elite wealth management. They instantly realized what Elias was describing. The color began to rapidly drain from Richard's heavily tanned face. A cold, nauseating sweat broke out across his forehead. His hand began to tremble so violently that the expensive scotch in his crystal tumbler sloshed over the rim, spilling onto his $4,000 Tom Ford suit. She transferred them where? Richard demanded, his voice cracking, the arrogant billionaire facade completely shattering to reveal the panicked, leveraged fraud underneath. Where is the money, Elias? Into a highly specialized, impenetrable corporate structure known as an irrevocable blind trust, Elias stated, delivering the lethal blow with surgical precision. Because the trust was established long before any declaration of medical incompetence, it is entirely, flawlessly insulated from your conservatorship. It cannot be contested. It cannot be undone by a family court judge. You have power of attorney over Alina Ashford, Richard. But Alina Ashford's net worth is legally zero. You have conservatorship over a ghost. No, that's impossible. Sarah shrieked, pushing her way to the front, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She dropped her crystal champagne glass. It hit the imported marble floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, but she didn't even notice. The Lake Como Villa, my trust fund. We are selling this house today. Julian has 3 cash offers. Julian Vance, the aggressively tanned real estate broker, was already physically backing away from Richard and Sarah. His eyes were wide with professional terror. He looked at the federal stamps on Elias' documents and instantly realized that Richard was attempting to sell a property he had absolutely no legal right to touch. It was title fraud on a massive federal scale. I am pulling the listings, Richard, Julian stammered, raising his hands in surrender, completely abandoning his clients. I want absolutely nothing to do with this. The offers are formally withdrawn. This is a federal crime. Shut up, Julian, Richard roared, his eyes wild, darting frantically between the documents and Elia's. He was hyperventilating, his mind desperately clawing for a loophole that simply did not exist. Fine, fine. So the money is in a trust, but my sister and I are the only living heirs. We are the biological children. I will petition the Supreme Court to audit the trust. I will have myself named as the sole executor of the estate. Elias let out a slow, humorless chuckle. It was a terrifying sound. That will be incredibly difficult, Richard, Elias whispered, stepping aside and turning his body to fully present the young man standing silently next to him. Because the irrevocable blind trust already has a legally designated executor and a sole, primary beneficiary. The paperwork was finalized, signed, and federally sealed 48 hours ago. Richard's bloodshot eyes slowly tracked over to Mateo. The young immigrant stood perfectly still in his bespoke midnight blue suit. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked at Richard with the exact same calm, absolute, unyielding dignity that Alina had displayed when Richard locked her in the rusted wheelchair. "You." Richard choked out, the word tearing from his throat in a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. His brain was completely short-circuiting. The universe was collapsing around him. My mother gave an $8 million estate to a Mexican janitor who mops up vomit. Mateo finally moved. He took one single, powerful step forward, closing the distance between himself and the man who had thrown his own mother away like garbage. When Mateo spoke, his voice was not loud, but it resonated with the crushing, undeniable authority of a man who held the absolute power of life and death over Richard's financial existence. "My name is Mateo Vargas," he said, his deep voice echoing across the silent, stunned room. "And your mother did not give me an estate, Richard. She entrusted me with a weapon designed specifically to destroy you." Mateo looked down at the shattered crystal champagne glass at Sarah's feet, and then back up into Richard's terrified, wide eyes. "You threw the woman who gave you life into a concrete cell," Mateo continued, every word hitting Richard like a physical blow to the chest. "You stripped her of her dignity, her freedom, and her name. You left her to starve on pureed food so you could drink vintage champagne in her house. But you made one fatal miscalculation, Richard. You forgot that the people you consider invisible, the people who clean your floors and wash your windows, we see absolutely everything." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely, utterly paralyzed by the staggering magnitude of his own destruction. If he didn't own the house, his tech startup would instantly default on its loans by Monday. He would be completely bankrupt. He would face federal charges for real estate fraud. But Mateo was not finished. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit, pulling out a sleek, modern smartphone, entirely taking command of the room. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and now it was time for the execution. Mateo did not dial a number on his sleek smartphone. Instead, he simply tapped the screen twice and turned it around, holding the bright, high-resolution display directly in front of Richard's trembling, sweat-drenched face. Displayed on the screen was the master financial dashboard of the Ashford Irrevocable Blind Trust. The numbers glowed in a crisp, undeniable green font. Richard's bloodshot eyes darted frantically across the screen, his pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated terror as his brain processed the catastrophic reality of the ledger. He saw the offshore bonds. He saw the massive, multi-million-dollar liquid cash reserves. He saw the property deed to the very mansion they were standing inside. And right at the top of the screen, listed as the sole, incontestable legal executor with absolute signatory authority over every single penny, was the name, Mateo Vargas. Beneath that, under a secondary tab labeled Personal Accounts, Alina Ashford, the balance read exactly $0. The fraudulent conservatorship Richard had spent tens of thousands of dollars to orchestrate, the horrific betrayal of locking his mother in a cinder-block cell, the vicious, calculated theft of her dignity. All of it had been for absolutely nothing. He had successfully seized control of an empty, bankrupt shell. "You leveraged your tech startup against the projected equity of this house, didn't you, Richard?" Matteo asked, his voice deathly calm, dissecting the arrogant billionaire's life with the precision of a forensic accountant. I spent the last 2 nights reviewing the estate's previous audit logs with Mr. Sterling. You took out a massive, high-interest bridge loan 3 weeks ago to keep your failing company afloat, using a fraudulent appraisal of this property as collateral. When the banks open on Monday morning and realize you pledged an asset you do not legally own, they are going to immediately call the loan. Richard's breath hitched in his throat. A pathetic, strangled whimpering sound escaped his lips. The bespoke, $4,000 Tom Ford suit he was wearing suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume on a broken, terrified little boy. That is bank fraud, Richard. Federal wire fraud. And title fraud, Elias Sterling chimed in, his voice radiating a lethal, predatory joy. The high-powered attorney adjusted his silver tie, stepping up beside Matteo to deliver the killing blow. And let's not forget the corrupt neurologist you paid $30,000 under the table to fabricate that dementia diagnosis. My private investigators paid him a visit last night. He completely broke under the threat of losing his medical license. We have his full, recorded confession. By Tuesday, you will not only be entirely bankrupt, but you will also be facing a multi-count federal indictment with a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years. No. Sarah suddenly shrieked, her voice shattering the tense silence like breaking glass. The reality of the situation had finally violently crashed into her shallow, materialistic brain. She lunged forward, her stunning emerald green designer dress rustling wildly, and grabbed Julian Vance, the real estate broker, by the lapels of his expensive blazer. "Julian, do something. Call the buyers back. We can lower the price. I need my payout. I already put a non-refundable deposit on the villa in Lake Como." Sarah screamed, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark, ugly streaks. Julian physically shoved Sarah off of him, looking at her with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. In the cutthroat world of the ultra-wealthy, there was no sin greater than being exposed as a fraud. "Do not ever touch me again, Sarah," Julian hissed, violently brushing his lapels as if she had just infected him with a disease. He turned to the crowd of stunned billionaires and corporate investors who were watching the spectacle in morbid fascination. "Ladies and gentlemen, this open house is officially canceled. Please make your way to the exits immediately. I apologize for this completely fraudulent waste of your time." The Chinese tech mogul, who had been laughing with Richard just 10 minutes prior, set his crystal tumbler of expensive scotch down on a marble side table with a sharp, dismissive clink. He didn't say a single word. He just shook his head in profound disgust, turned his back on Richard, and walked out the front door. It was the signal for a mass, immediate exodus. The illusion was entirely shattered. The high society elite, the people Richard and Sarah had desperately tried to impress and emulate, abandoned them without a second thought. The private caterers quietly stopped serving caviar and began packing up their silver platters. The string quartet packed their violins and cellos in absolute silence. Outside, the cobblestone driveway erupted into a chaotic symphony of revving luxury engines as the fleet of Aston Martins, Ferraris, and Mercedes SUVs aggressively peeled out of the estate, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Richard's impending federal indictment. Within 5 agonizing minutes, the sprawling, 8,000-square-foot mansion was completely emptied of its glamorous crowd. There was no one left but Richard, Sarah, the towering figure of Elias Sterling, and the young immigrant who now held their entire world in the palm of his calloused hands. Richard's knees literally buckled. He collapsed onto the imported marble floor, the pristine fabric of his tailored trousers tearing as he hit the hard stone. He looked up at Matteo, the arrogant, sociopathic monster completely replaced by a pathetic, hyperventilating coward. "Please," Richard begged, tears of sheer, unadulterated panic streaming down his heavily tanned face. He clasped his hands together, groveling at the feet of the man he had called a filthy janitor mere minutes ago. "Matteo, "Mr. Vargas, please, I am her son. I am her flesh and blood. If the banks call the loan, I will lose everything. I will go to prison. Please just give me the house. I'll give you 10%. I'll give you 20% of the sale. Just sign the paperwork back over to me." Sarah dropped to her knees right next to her brother, sobbing hysterically, clutching her limited edition Chanel handbag to her chest like a life preserver. "We're family. You can't do this to a family. We made a mistake, that's all. We'll move her to a nicer facility, a private suite. Just please don't take our money." Mateo looked down at the two sobbing, broken millionaires groveling on the floor. His expression did not soften. There was not a single ounce of pity in his dark brown eyes. He felt only the cold, hard, crushing weight of absolute justice. "Family is not defined by blood, Richard," Mateo stated, his deep voice vibrating with the profound, heavy wisdom of a man who had survived the harshest realities of life. "Family is defined by dignity. It is defined by loyalty. It is defined by how you treat the people who gave you everything when they can no longer do anything for you. You lost the right to call yourselves her family the exact second you strapped her into that rusted wheelchair and threw her away like garbage." Mateo took a deliberate step back, physically distancing himself from their toxic presence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope bearing the seal of Elias Law Firm. He dropped it onto the marble floor, right between Richard and Sarah. "That is a formal, federally backed eviction notice," Mateo commanded, his voice echoing through the massive, empty foyer like a judge delivering a final verdict. "As the sole legal executor of this property, I am ordering you to vacate this premises. You have exactly 2 hours. You will take only the clothes you brought onto the property this morning. The cars parked in the garage, the antique furniture, the jewelry bought with estate funds, everything remains here. It belongs to the trust. If you are still inside these walls at 3:15 p.m., Mr. Sterling will direct the local sheriff's department to forcibly remove you for criminal trespassing." Sarah let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream of pure agony, burying her face in her hands as her entire universe collapsed into dust. Richard simply stared blankly at the white envelope on the floor, his mind completely snapping under the crushing realization that his life was permanently, irreversibly destroyed. Mateo did not stay to watch them cry. He had no interest in their pathetic tears. He had accomplished the mission he was entrusted with. He turned his back on the shattered siblings and walked out the grand mahogany doors, stepping into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. Elias followed closely behind him. "Flawless execution, Mr. Vargas," Elias said, a rare, genuine smile of profound respect crossing the ruthless lawyer's face. "The security team will remain on site to ensure they leave with nothing. What is our next move?" Mateo walked over to the massive, pitch-black Lincoln Navigator idling in the driveway. He looked at his calloused hands, remembering the warmth of the small porcelain teacup and the incredibly brave, brilliant woman who was still sitting in a dark, cinder-block cell waiting for him. Mateo opened the passenger door. His eyes were fierce, filled with an overwhelming, beautiful determination. "We are going back to Shady Pines, Elias," Mateo said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is time to bring my mother home." The massive, pitch-black Lincoln Navigator glided like a silent, predatory shark through the cracked, weed-infested asphalt parking lot of Shady Pines Care Facility. The sheer presence of the luxurious, heavily armored SUV was a jarring, almost alien contrast to the depressing, state-subsidized brick building that loomed ahead. The facility stood under the gray afternoon sky like a forgotten warehouse for the dying, radiating a heavy, suffocating aura of institutional despair. Inside the lobby, beneath the sickening buzz of dying fluorescent lights, head nurse Brenda was aggressively chewing her peppermint gum. She was casually leaning against the chipped Formica front desk, scrolling through a gossip magazine, entirely ignoring the faint, muffled cries of a patient calling for help down the hall. The automatic sliding glass doors of the lobby hissed open. Brenda didn't even look up from her magazine. "Visiting hours are strictly over at 3 o'clock," she barked in her abrasive, nasal voice. "Come back tomorrow, and wipe your feet. The janitor hasn't mopped the lobby yet." The heavy, authoritative footsteps clicking against the cheap linoleum floor did not stop. They marched directly toward the front desk with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Brenda let out an exaggerated, highly annoyed sigh and finally snapped her head up, preparing to unleash her standard barrage of bureaucratic hostility. The words instantly died in her throat. Her jaw went completely slack, and the piece of peppermint gum nearly fell from her lips. Standing directly in front of her was not a lost family member. It was Elias Sterling, a man whose bespoke charcoal-gray pinstripe suit and icy, predator-like gaze practically radiated federal authority. And standing right beside the terrifying lawyer was a young man in a flawless, custom-tailored midnight blue Italian wool suit. Brenda's brain aggressively short-circuited. She recognized the broad shoulders. She recognized the dark hair. But her mind simply could not reconcile the image of a high-society billionaire standing in her lobby with the exhausted, impoverished immigrant she verbally abused on a daily basis. Mateo. Brenda gasped, her voice cracking in utter bewilderment. Her eyes darted wildly from his polished, handmade leather Oxfords to the crisp knot of his silk tie. What the hell are you wearing? You missed your afternoon shift. You're supposed to be emptying the biohazard bins in the West Wing. I am reporting you to the director. You are completely fired." Mateo did not flinch. He did not look at the floor the way he was forced to do every single day for the past 2 years. He looked down at Brenda with a gaze so cold, so profoundly powerful, that the cruel nurse instinctively took a physical step back, bumping into the filing cabinets behind her. Before Mateo could even speak, Elias Sterling stepped forward, placing his heavy leather briefcase onto the Formica counter with a loud, dominant slam. "Brenda Hopkins," Elias stated, reading her name tag with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Registered nurse license number 448-912. I am Elias Sterling, senior managing partner at Sterling Legal Group. We are not here to discuss Mr. Vargas's employment status at this miserable, federally under-investigated slaughterhouse. We are here to retrieve my client, Mrs. Alina Ashford." Brenda's face flushed a deep, panicked red. The illusion of her petty, tyrannical authority over the nursing home was instantly vaporized by the sheer, crushing weight of a high-powered corporate litigator. You can't do that." Brenda stammered, frantically grabbing a clipboard to hide her violently trembling hands. "Mrs. Ashford is under a strict, court-ordered emergency conservatorship. Her son, Richard Ashford, gave us explicit, legally binding instructions that absolutely no one is allowed to see her or remove her from this facility without his direct, written authorization." Elias leaned over the counter, completely invading Brenda's personal space. His silver hair caught the flickering fluorescent light, and his eyes narrowed into 2 lethal slits. "Richard Ashford is currently barricaded inside an empty mansion, waiting for the federal authorities to arrest him for massive real estate fraud and medical forgery," Elias whispered, his voice dripping with venomous joy. He pulled a heavy, sealed document from his inside coat pocket and threw it onto the desk. "This is a writ of habeas corpus, signed directly by a federal judge an hour ago, completely and permanently dissolving the fraudulent conservatorship. Alina Ashford is a free woman." Elias leaned in even closer, until Brenda could smell the expensive cologne on his suit. "Furthermore, Miss Hopkins, I have just filed a massive, multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against Shady Pines Care Facility for gross medical negligence, human rights violations, and elder abuse. I have the sworn testimony of your former janitor, who has meticulously documented every single time you denied Mrs. Ashford food, mocked her sanity, and violated state care protocols. By the time I am finished with you, this entire building will be bulldozed, and you will never legally be allowed to hold a medical license in the United States again. Now, give me the master key to the West Wing. Right now." Brenda was hyperventilating, tears of sheer, Absolute terror welled up in her eyes. Her hands shook so violently that the clipboard clattered to the floor. Without saying a single word, she frantically pulled the heavy brass master key from her lanyard and pushed it across the counter. Mateo picked up the key. He didn't look at Brenda again. She was a ghost. She was a defeated, pathetic bully who was about to face the terrifying wrath of the justice system. Mateo turned and walked down the dark, bleach-scented hallway of the West Wing. The familiar sounds of the nursing home, the dripping faucets, the squeaking wheels of medical carts, the low murmurs of forgotten residents echoed around him. But he was no longer a prisoner to this place. He was a conqueror. He reached the heavy wooden door of Alina's cinderblock cell. He slid the brass key into the lock. With a heavy clack, the deadbolt surrendered. Mateo pushed the door open. Alina Ashford was sitting exactly where he had left her hours ago. She was seated perfectly straight on the edge of her narrow, uncomfortable hospital bed, wearing the faded, scratchy blue patient gown. She was looking out the narrow, iron-barred window at the dying oak tree, her hands delicately folded in her lap. Hearing the door open, Alina slowly turned her head. For a moment she just looked at him. She took in the flawless midnight blue suit, the polished shoes, and the undeniable aura of strength and dignity radiating from the young man. The icy, calculating, ruthless matriarch who had orchestrated the ultimate financial apocalypse suddenly vanished. The rigid lines on her face softened, and a profound, incredibly beautiful, and deeply human warmth flooded her sharp eyes. "Mateo," Alina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It is done, Mrs. Ashford," Mateo said softly, stepping into the small room and gently closing the door behind him. The open house was completely shut down. The high society buyers fled the property. Richard and Sarah have been formally evicted. They lost the house, they lost the trust, and by Monday morning, Richard's company will face total bankruptcy. They are completely, utterly ruined. Lena closed her eyes. A single heavy tear escaped her lashes, tracing a slow path down her wrinkled cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of absolute, overwhelming liberation. The children who had ripped her heart out and thrown her away had faced the ultimate devastating consequence of their own bottomless greed. Justice, cold and absolute, had been served. She opened her eyes and looked deeply at Mateo. "And what about the irrevocable blind trust, Mateo? Did Elias execute the transfer?" "I hold the absolute signatory authority, ma'am," Mateo confirmed, his voice filled with reverence. "The estate is entirely secure. The $8 million, the offshore accounts, the mansion, everything is safe. As your legal executor, I am ready to transfer it all directly back into your personal name the moment the courts open on Monday." Alina smiled. It was the warmest, most maternal smile Mateo had ever seen. She slowly shook her head. "No, Mateo," Alina said gently, reaching out her fragile hand. Mateo immediately stepped forward, taking her hand in both of his calloused ones. "I do not want the estate transferred back to my name. I am an old woman nearing the end of my journey. The documents you signed with Elias were not temporary. They are permanent." Mateo's eyes widened in absolute shock. "Mrs. Ashford, I can't. It's an empire. It's your entire life's work." "And I choose to leave my life's work to a man who truly understands the value of human dignity," Alina replied, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "My biological children looked at me and saw nothing but a dying bank account. They saw an obstacle to their luxury. But you, a young man struggling to survive, carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, you looked at a forgotten, discarded old woman and you saw a human being. You risked your only livelihood just to bring me a cup of warm tea. You gave me back my soul, Mateo. You did not just earn my estate. You earned my absolute respect." Alina tightened her grip on his hands. "You are the sole beneficiary, Mateo. The Ashford Empire belongs to you now. All I ask in return is that you let an old woman live out the rest of her days in the home she built, surrounded by someone who actually cares for her." Tears blurred Mateo's vision. The sheer, staggering weight of her generosity, the profound beauty of her trust, broke down the heavy walls he had built around his own heart to survive in a cruel world. He dropped to one knee beside her bed, pressing her fragile hand to his forehead. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." "Mother," Matteo whispered, his voice cracking with immense emotion. Eleanor's heart swelled. She gently stroked his dark hair. The cruel, ruthless nightmare was finally over. "Take me home, Matteo," she whispered. Matteo stood up. He did not reach for the squeaking, rusted metal wheelchair that Richard had forced her into. That chair was a symbol of her imprisonment, and she would never sit in it again. Instead, Matteo gently offered her his strong arm. Eleanor placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. With incredible, unyielding dignity, the 76-year-old matriarch stood up on her own 2 feet. Together, arm in arm, they walked out of the cinder-block cell. They walked slowly but proudly down the dark hallway of the West Wing. As they passed the front desk, Nurse Brenda was still cowering in the corner, her face buried in her hands, completely destroyed by the terrifying reality of Elia's federal lawsuit. Eleanor did not even glance at her. A queen does not acknowledge an insect. The automatic sliding glass doors hissed open, and they stepped out of the suffocating, bleach-scented darkness. The late afternoon sun hit them instantly, wrapping them in a brilliant, golden warmth. The crisp, fresh air filled Eleanor's lungs. Waiting directly at the curb was the massive, luxurious Lincoln Navigator, with Elia Sterling standing respectfully by the open passenger door. Matteo gently helped Eleanor into the plush leather seat. He closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. The powerful engine roared to life, and the heavy SUV glided away from shady pines, leaving the nightmare behind forever. 40 minutes later, the Lincoln navigated through the towering wrought-iron gates of the Ashford estate. The circular cobblestone driveway was completely empty. The fleet of luxury sports cars, the greedy real estate brokers, and the toxic, entitled children were entirely gone. The majestic, $8 million mansion stood quietly in the golden light of the setting sun, cleansed of the parasites that had tried to consume it. Matteo parked the car and helped Eleanor step out onto the cobblestones. She looked up at the towering stone pillars, the massive oak doors, and the beautiful, manicured gardens she and her late husband had planted 50 years ago. She was finally home. We live in a world that is obsessed with the illusion of bloodlines and the toxic entitlement of inheritance. Society often tells us that family is strictly defined by biology, regardless of how cruelly those biological relatives may treat us. But the harrowing reality of the American nursing home system proves otherwise. Thousands of elderly individuals are locked away in dark, forgotten rooms by children who are desperately eager to read their wills. True family is not a guarantee written in DNA. True family is an action. It is defined by unwavering loyalty, by profound respect, and by the people who choose to treat you with absolute dignity when you have absolutely nothing left to offer them. The most magnificent empires in the world are not built on greed and manipulation. They are sustained by the quiet, unyielding power of empathy. When arrogance and cruelty attempt to steal the crown, they will always be utterly destroyed by the quiet strength of a righteous heart. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. See you in the next video.